Well, thank you, everybody. A special thank you to the two Christinas who made this wonderful workshop happen. It really is a privilege to have a conversation about, a topic that I'm so passionate about with other people who share that passion and interest. And it's, very rare that you get to speak with people who've read the same documents and know the same stories. It's also a very interesting time to be in London at the moment. And I think it's kind of reminded me of the reasons why I was interested in questions of empire in the first place. And, the confusing for me attraction of the foreign monarch and these emotive feelings that people can feel for kings and queens. So thank you for bringing us all here, and thank you to the universe for happening at this particular moment. Okay, so what I learned from being immersed in the Spanish archives of the British invasion and occupation of Manila was that Spaniards who were in Luzon in 1763 regarded the Indios and Sangles who rose up in rebellion against them as the greatest threat to Spanish colonial rule at that moment. It was a moment of extreme alarm and a sense of emergency. By the middle of that year, the rival European governments in the Philippines were certain that the British would be totally defeated and ejected from the islands. However, the fate of the native insurgency was less clear. Dawson Drake noted that when the British eventually withdrew and, quote, the islands are restored to the crown of Spain, their monarch will find himself either obliged to abandon them to the Indians or conquer them at an immense expense of treasure and men. So my presentation today draws on research for my forthcoming book, and I'll analyse the ideology and organisation of the revolts against empire that the British invasion triggered in Luzon. And I'll also talk about the massive majority Indigenous loyalist forces that mobilised to defeat them. My goal is to Philippinize the history of the 7 Years' War in Luzon. I want to illuminate how Indigenous Filipinos experienced, participated in, and determined the outcomes of this war, which have really been marginalized in studies that focus on and often celebrate the actions of European military leaders, including Drake and Anda. I also put the Philippines briefly in anti-colonial war in a global perspective, reading it alongside simultaneous armed struggles against empire that broke out in other parts of the globe at that time. So we'll start by zooming out of Manila. The dominant interpretation of the 7 Years' War defines this conflict as a war between Europe's most powerful states, Great Britain, France, Spain, and their European allies, for control of people, land, and territory on a planetary scale. I want to advance an alternative approach to the war's history that recognises that its major battles and clashes were clashes that pitted Indigenous, Black, and other non-European fighting forces who sought to abolish empire and slavery against counter-revolutionary multi-ethnic armies and militias that fought to defend these colonial systems of exploitation. This is surely the character that the war assumed in 1763 across the globe. And I've got a screenshot just from Wikipedia showing this kind of idea of the war as like a European war. So the 7 Years' War in North America is commonly known as the French and Indian War. This nomenclature points to the central role that Native Americans played in this conflict. First Nations fighting men backed the French against the British, which is an alliance that was rooted in deep Franco-Indian ties that dated back several generations. And the British, in turn, benefited from an alliance with the Iroquois. This war Nations allies refused to submit to the Redcoats. As the Obiwa chief Minavana declared, and I've got the quote up here, "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, these mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none." The Indian and French war against the British morphed into a pan-Indian war against empire in 1763. Ottawas, Potawatomis, and Hurons laid siege to British forts and raided homesteads across the high country. Religion stirred the Indians to join this anti-colonial revolt. The Delaware prophet Neolin preached that the master of life had visited him in a dream and told him that these people should return to a traditional way of life, cut off all ties with Europeans, and abandon their culture, including alcohol and their dress. Meanwhile, the abolitionists Berbice slave uprising broke out in Guyana, a Dutch colony in the Caribbean coast of South America in the beginning of 1763. Here, hundreds of enslaved Africans set fire to the plantations where they labored under brutal conditions and abandoned them. Former slaves formed a government and controlled most of the colony for almost a year. Eventually, Indigenous Carib and Arawak peoples fought with the Dutch soldiers sent from the Netherlands to suppress this revolt. So how does our understanding of 1763 in the Philippines change when we read it in the context of these global anti-colonial and abolitionist rebellions? The 7 Years' War bound these revolts across vast distances. So we know in the Philippines that Simon de Anda and Salazar and Noidor from Manila's Audiencia refused to surrender to the British when they attacked and captured Intramuros in October 1762. Governing the Philippines in the name of the Spanish king, Anda went into exile outside of the city. He collaborated with Indigenous and Chinese mestizo elites and militant missionaries to raise a huge majority Indigenous loyalist army to fight against the British, whose numbers were bolstered by local Chinese recruits. Anda found himself fighting a two-front war against the British and against the native communities who'd risen up in rebellion. The British struggled to push beyond the walled city of Manila. As the Augustinian Fray Castro wrote, the invaders were more like prisoners in a presidio of the Catholic king than soldiers who had conquered a city. Nonetheless, Spain's loss of the walled city of Manila was very important symbolically, and it signaled the fragility of Spanish rule in the islands. In the final months of 1762, the colonial order began to unravel as news of the loss of Manila spread quickly through Luzon. In Lingayen, in Pangasinan, a conceited and stupid mestizo shouted loudly in the streets, "Now there is no king, no priest, and no alcalde." In November and December, in Ilocos and Pangasinan, large, armed and angry mobs gathered at convents and colonial government buildings, demanding a pause on tribute payments for as long as the British occupied Manila, on top of other demands. There were some 3,000 protesters at Binalongtongan, which is Pangasinan's largest town, and an estimated 2,000 people protested at the alcalde mayor's residence in Bigan, where Diego Silang appeared to be their leader. By the beginning of 63, these rebellions had transitioned into a full-blown anti-colonial war that pitted loyalists against rebel militias. Historians have previously interpreted the rebellions in Pangasinan and Ilocos as two distinct regionally limited movements, the former headed by Juan de la Cruz Palares and the latter led by Diego Silang and eventually his widow Gabriella. But the archive points to close connections between these indigenous or simultaneous revolts. The clergy regarded the people who rose up in revolt in Binalongtongan and Bigan as allies. The Dominican Friar Melendez noted the people of Pangasinan are united with those of Ilocos. Silang sent letters to rebels in Pangasinan, and notably his contemporaries identified Silang and many of the insurgents in Ilocos as being ethnically Pangasinanese, and they suggested that Silang spoke the language and had kinship ties to the province. Blood ties deepened the connections between rebels across the region. The extent to which Silang was really in charge of this rebellion was most likely exaggerated by Silang and his followers, as well as by the Spanish government of the day. I think the fact that Silang was a prolific writer and that a large cache of his writings have survived also influenced recent assessments of Silang's leadership. The rebels' early cries for a temporary moratorium on tribute evolved into a radical demand for tribute abolition, which highlights the revolt's anti-colonial character. In Loag, rebels broke into the local church and they destroyed the registry of tribute payments, which was where the government used to manage tribute collections over generations. Many people who joined the revolt sought to abolish the core mechanisms through which the colonial government extracted labor and other resources from their communities, including the polo and the bandala. Silang echoed common grievances when he repeatedly asserted that this complex system of exploitation impoverished Filipinos. The Spaniards, quote, will let you wear nothing but a loincloth, leaving you only your Christianity, quote. Surely these grievances were not new among Filipinos, but the 7 Years' War presented a unique opportunity to redress historic wrongs. Tribute abolition was radical because the work that tribute did for empire extended far beyond raising revenue. Tribute did the heavy lifting in the creation of what historians have called the colonial difference. As a head tax on some, tribute strengthened the sliding scale of inferiority among imperial subjects, divided colonial society between tributaries who are indigenous Filipinos and Chinese migrants in the Philippines context, and those who are exempt because they were Spaniards and mestizos. Tribute was such a fundamental part of the platform upon which the whole colonial system stood that its abolition threatened to bring it crashing down. Other historians have noted that this Silang Revolt adopted the characteristics of a class war. Silang condemned Indigenous elites for being complicit in the exploitation of the Indigenous majority, and he encouraged his followers to take revenge on them, and they did. One of the first things that the people of Ilocos did when they joined the revolt was to set up tribunals in their towns and put the Principalia on trial. Benito Estrada, who was said to be one of Silang's brother-in-laws, oversaw a people's tribunal in Batak, where the Timawas forced the Principales to answer to crimes alleged against them. They forced the Principales to pay a 20 peso fine as a penalty for their crimes and made them turn over all of their possessions, including all of their wives' and daughters' jewelry. The judges, all peasants, then ordered the Principales to come before them one by one, kneel and kiss their hands. Such scenes prompted Vivar to write that Silang must have turned the world upside down, making the Principales Timawas and the Timawas Principales. Historians have downplayed the great Indigenous revolt's deeply Catholic character, even though this saturates the archive. I think recognizing religion's role in the revolt sheds light on why devout villagers joined this war against empire. Silang repeatedly claimed that God himself was responsible for the rebellion and had chosen him to lead it. As God was all-powerful, how could it be otherwise? He reasoned not even a leaf on a tree moves unless it is God's will. Silang appointed himself Cabo Mayor, or Major Corporal of this Catholic army, reserving the position of general for the revered image of the Nazarene Christ, whose sanctuary was in Sinait. Silanistas fashioned a scepter and a small golden helmet for this image of Christ, symbols of military and political power, to acknowledge and honor his role in the war. Silang insisted that this santo was calling the shots. The Nazarene was a defining element of Silanista culture. Soldiers in the Catholic army marched into battle under flags bearing the image of the Nazarene Christ or his name. They adopted a uniform of sorts, wearing clothes bearing Catholic symbols and donning rope necklaces. They held carved figures of Christ close to their hearts. When loyalist troops captured the 60-year-old Silanista Antonio de la Cruz in late December of 1762, he was wearing a white cloak emblazoned with a cross, for example. Such religious symbols and objects were a statement of the rebels' Catholic identity. They doubled as talismans for sure that afforded protection, shielding their bodies from enemy bullets and arrows. Convictions in such potent objects blended local Filipino conceptions of power as a real force that could be physically accumulated in anting-anting and Catholic traditions around sacred and powerful relics and other material objects. It's interesting that the revolt's expansion across Luzon was underpinned by negotiation. The friars who witnessed the rebellion on the ground noted its kind of democratic character. The thousands of people who gathered in Bigan at the outset of the rebellion in mid-December of 1762 were said to have spent the night before they rallied in meetings, deliberating over their demands and their strategies. This is not to say that individual and collective decisions to support or oppose the revolt were not made under duress, because they were. When the Silanista, known as Caramba from Badok, went to Batak to recruit the community to the revolt, he allegedly threatened to set the village on fire if the people refused his invitation. Spanish that this is a peaceful conquest. In my book, I analyse in depth the composition of the majority Indigenous loyalist army that mobilised to fight against the British and the communities in rebellion. I showed that military recruitment drew on well-established local practices to fight raising militias to fight enemies in emergency situations, and also recruiting workers for the polo. we see these were very diverse forces. In one unit was made up of the firstborn sons of principales from Pampanga, but we know that missionaries also recruited like 2,000 or 3,000 Igorots to fight against the loyalists, to fight against the rebels. So it was a very diverse movement. Some of the literature on the Silang Revolt has argued that this Silang rebellion was one of the first a proto-nationalist movement, because it recruited people from very different linguistic backgrounds. But the counter-revolutionary movement could also be seen as a kind of proto-nationalist, conservative, Catholic, loyal patria. So I'll now talk about why people joined this loyalist counter-revolutionary army. The Catholic Church was crucial to the formation of loyalist militias and to undermining support for the anti-colonial revolt, leading to its demise. All of the major missionary orders in the islands, with the exception of the San Juan de Dios Hospital Order, who were traitors, helped to suppress the loyalist army. Convent churches housed and fed native militias. They also donated firearms and gunpowder that they had amassed. So basically they were their resources that they'd amassed to fight Moro pirates that were now redirected to this war. Priests condemned the rebellion from the pulpit. In the small Ilocos town of Dingras, the Augustinian friar Manuel Alvarez preached that Silang and his corporals were enemies of God and the king, and that their followers would burn in hell. The clergy counseled their parishioners to join the loyalist campaign, which they framed as a holy war, and much the same rhetoric they used to frame the war against Moro pirates. Surely the destruction of sacred buildings and objects by the invading British and rebel militias contributed to the campaign's characterization as a war to defend the Mother Church and the faith. Many members of the clergy also took up arms, fighting alongside native militiamen. Bishop Ustoritz and Pedro Becbec, a native Apodoradillo from Santa Ana, organized for Miguel Vicos to assassinate Diego Silang in May of 1763. The bishop spiritually prepared the assassin for this task, hearing Becbec's confession, blessing him, and gifting him with a protective relic. And importantly, the priests went on strike in rebel districts. They withdrew their spiritual labor from communities in revolt. They refused to provide baptisms, marriages, and do the ceremony of anointing the sick at the end of life. And they understood that the priests understood their unique power stemmed from their ability to deliver people salvation. Many Catholics would have believed that if they or their kin died without receiving these sacraments, their souls would be damned to suffer in hell for all of eternity. And these strategies were effective in bolstering support for the Loyalist campaign. Rebel and Loyalist forces clashed in skirmishes and battles across the insurgent provinces in June and July. The insurgency in Ilocos suffered a serious blow when rebels were defeated and a major battle began in the end of July. An estimated 20,000 people participated in this bloody confrontation, making it the largest military engagement of the entire 7 Years' War in the Philippines. The Loyalists attributed their victory to divine intervention. They said that the insurgents had been tricked by an illusion that the coppices of Vigan's churches appeared as thousands of Loyalist soldiers, prompting them to flee. And they attributed this miracle to the Virgin of Caridad, a sacred image of the Mother of God that was venerated in the nearby city of Bantay, where locals shunned the uprising. War and typhoons brought a famine to Ilocos that emptied the towns of people. Entire families fled to the mountains, searching for something to eat, and the people's appetite for revolt diminished as their hunger grew. We know Loyalist militias hunted down and arrested Gabriella Silang and her army, hanging her until dead and using a kind of trappish to kill over 90 of her corporals. In Pangasinan, Loyalists destroyed the whole town of Binalongtangan with fire. And to erase the memory of the revolt, the colonial government constructed a new town that they named San Carlos, a few kilometers away from the town, instead of rebuilding it. The last major battle between rebels and Loyalists took place in Calasiao in Pangasinan in the beginning of 1764. And in 1765, Juan de la Cruz Polares was The war that raged across Luzon in 1763 is best characterized as a civil war between local anti-colonial forces and a Philippinized counter-revolutionary Loyalist army. Men like Anda imagined their victory as a victory over subversive Indios and Sanglays, which is clear in this image that's in the Newberry Library that shows Anda triumphant, and in the bottom of the image are the severed heads of Chinese men. So this image doesn't look like a victory over the British, but a victory over the rebellious Chinese. I think the value of studying the war is that it illuminates these complex criticisms of colonial systems of exploitation that were held and articulated by non-European peoples in the Pacific. And it also deepens our understanding of how Spain's empire functioned and the sources of its surprising resilience to internal and external shocks. Although this invasion of Manila reveals the fragility of this whole Spanish colonial system, it also shows its surprising strength. The Hispanic monarchy, like other imperial powers, implemented major reforms to strengthen empire in the wake of the war, which Jody talked about at length. This included the expulsion of all China-born boys and men aged 12 years and older, in addition to the expansion of fortifications and military reforms. And I think these post-war imperial reforms should be understood as strategies to counter threats posed by the monarch's Asian vassals. And that's often overlooked in his arguments about economic, the desire to improve the political economy of empire. And that is it.